Now, one of the greatest gifts that God has ever given us, well, I guess Jesus is the greatest gift, but one of the great gifts that God has given us is his promises. And the Bible is full of these wonderful promises from Genesis through to Revelation. And these promises have been written down and preserved for us to fill us with hope and to fill us with encouragement. And I think God's promises are especially relevant when we're starting something new. And being a new year, this is a sort of transition time for us, and all of us, probably most of us, are starting something new. There was one person I talked to this morning, and I said, "What's new?" And they said, "There's nothing new." But I'm guessing that's probably the exception. Probably most of us have something new, whether it's a new grade we're going into this year, maybe it's a new job we're starting, maybe it's a new house we're moving into, a new relationship we're starting, or whatever it is. All of us probably have something that is new in our life that we're stepping into. And one of the things about new things is it often involves stepping into the unknown as well. And so we thought it would be great to, as we are going through all these new things, should we spend some time reflecting on some of the wonderful promises that God has given us. Now, the reason we've called this series All God's Promises Are Yes is it's based on a verse in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 20, which says, "For no matter how many promises God has made, they are yes in Christ." And Paul was the person who wrote this, and when he's writing this, he's writing a letter to a group of Christians in the city of Corinth. And for a while leading up to this, Paul had been wanting to go and visit them. And in fact, he'd been telling them, "I'm coming to visit you, I'm coming to visit you, I'm coming to visit you." But Paul kept having things that kept changing his plans. Has anyone ever been in that situation where you've promised someone, I'm going to do something, and then something comes up and you don't follow through with your promise? I know I've certainly been in that situation, and it doesn't make you feel good, and you feel like you've let people down. And so Paul he's writing here, and he sort of anticipates that the people he's writing to get this sort of sense that he's saying out of one side of his mouth, yes, I'm coming, but then he's not actually following through, and he's saying no out of the other side of his mouth. And as Paul is sort of trying to explain himself in this letter, he takes a time out just to reflect on God's trustworthiness. And he says, no matter how many promises God has made for us, they never fall through. All of God's promises are yes. And so in this series, over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be unpacking 3 of God's promises. We don't have time to cover all of God's promises, but we're going to go through 3 of them. And to start with, we've got one that I think is one of the sort of all-time great promises from the Old Testament, one that you have likely heard before. And this is what we're going to be unpacking today. So the promise is God's promise to be with us. And it's found in Joshua chapter 1 and verse 9, and it says this: "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." Is there anyone here who loves traveling to a new country? A few hands. Okay, here's another thing. Has anyone here ever felt a little bit nervous when you're arriving in that new country? A few people? Now, it's probably been a little while. I know I haven't traveled overseas for a few years now. But let's just sort of paint this picture. So you've arrived, your plane has landed, and you've arrived in the airport, and there's kind of this river of people, and you just sort of hop in and you work your way through the corridors at the airport, and eventually you come to a place that looks something like this. The immigration desk. And you line up and you look around, and you only see serious faces. And you see people there who are security guards, you have metal detectors, maybe there's a police dog that's sniffing bags. People are scanning their fingerprints. And there's kind of just like this anxiousness that you feel in the room. And then you sort of make your way to the desk, and the person maybe asks you some interrogating questions. And even if you know that you've got everything you need, you always have this little sense like, what if they don't let me through? And you hand over your passport, and they look at there, and they check your details. And then what a relief you get when they stamp your passport and they say, "Welcome to our country," and you walk through. Now, one of the more memorable border crossings that I've had was a number of years ago when I went to the country of Israel. Now, leading up to, this is actually a picture of Jordan, which I'll explain why this is where we started. So we had been on a trip, we'd been in the Middle East, and I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but the nation of Israel and a lot of other countries in the Middle East don't always get along. And in fact, if you're in a lot of Middle East countries, you actually can't get flights that fly from those countries to Israel. And so logistically, the way that we found was the best way to get to Israel was to first fly to Jordan and then make our way from the capital, Amman, in Jordan, by taxi across to the border there, which is right where the Jordan River is that you've read about in the Bible. And then you cross the Jordan River, and then the next thing you hit is the city of Jericho, and then you make your way down to where we're staying, which was in Jerusalem. And one of the really cool things about this way of entering Israel is you might have picked up that it's actually the exact same way that the Israelites entered into Israel over 3,000 years ago, when they went with all that big group of people, and they went in there to enter into the Promised Land. And so there we are, we're in the taxi and we're making our way, and it was quite scenic in the hills, but when we actually arrived at the border, you could just feel all of this this political tension or sort of accumulating right there on the border. And just the scenes that you see when you're crossing the border, there's fences that say that there's landmines and there's buildings with bullet holes in them, and it's just, I felt very vulnerable and anxious going along here. And you're sort of thinking, okay, we weren't in a tour group or anything, and we're thinking, we've read online what we need to do to get across here, but I hope it actually works out. And so you go into this little building, and they took our passports off us, and they didn't give them back, and we were a bit nervous about that. Then you hop into this little bus, and that takes you across the border along this no man's land where you just see sort of no one in this region. And then the other side, there was all this sort of these military people with very large weapons that they were walking around with, and it just felt I felt really nervous going across this border crossing. But eventually, we did get through, and it was okay. But one of the things that it really made me think of was, we were just going there for a holiday. Imagine if you were a part of those Israelites who was going to the Promised Land 3,000 years ago, where you were not just only going there as tourists, but you were going there in order to start a war with these people, to kick them out and to possess this land. How nerve-wracking would that have been? Imagine if you were one of those people. And so, but one of the things that made it not so bad was they had this mighty leader named Moses. And we know about Moses. And Moses was this courageous guy, and he was the guy that walked up to Pharaoh and pointed his finger and said, I have a message from God, let my people go. And he was the one that sort of really held them together those 40 years through the wilderness. And he was the one that was going to be their leader going into the Promised Land. But word comes, Moses has died. What's going to happen now? And this is the context that we find ourselves in when we get to Joshua, the beginning of the book of Joshua. And so we're going to read just a few verses that create the sort of the context for our promise that we're looking at today. So the book of Joshua begins like this. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people, get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give them, to the Israelites. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. Not only, Joshua, are you going into this land that's full of fortified cities and giant people and all sorts of scary things, but you are now the new Moses. You are now going to lead them in. How would you feel if God gave you a job description like that? Now, there's lots of leadership roles that you could be called to, but this is one I don't ever want to be called to do. This is a huge task that Joshua is being called to. And so it's in this context, this big, daunting thing, that God gives this wonderful promise. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. In fact, this promise must have been important because it's not actually written once. We actually find it 7 times at this part of the story. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Because God is saying, because I will be with you as you make your way in. As I thought about this promise, I thought, you know what? This is not just a promise for them, but it's really a promise for us today as well. And there's actually some parallels between the situation that Joshua found himself in and where we find ourselves in as well. In the Old Testament, there's this big story of God rescuing the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, bringing them out, wandering through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. But in the New Testament, that becomes kind of like this little miniature story that's really just prefiguring the grander story of salvation, where God would rescue us not from slavery to Pharaoh, but slavery to sin, and then he would lead us towards our heavenly promised land. And so in a similar sort of way, we find ourselves also on the borders of the promised land, and we are going through those final things before entering in. And so I think that this promise, just as it was so important to Joshua, is something that is really important for us as well. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. So here's the big idea that I want you to get away from this promise. Strength and courage comes from realizing that God is on your team and by trusting in him. Strength and courage comes from realizing that God is on your team and by trusting in him. Now, back when I was in high school, one of my favorite sports to play was squash. And we don't play squash very often anymore, but I think it's a great sport. And my mum was a squash player, and so she got me involved in it. And then soon we joined the local squash comp, which was in Wauchope. If anyone knows where Wauchope is, you can probably imagine it's not a very big squash comp. But that led from there to me playing, representing my school for squash. And the highest award I got for playing squash was I got a silver medal at the state finals for squash. Now, I know what you're thinking. You must be really great at squash. Well, here's what I discovered. You don't actually need to be great at squash to win a silver medal at the state finals. You just need some really good people on your team. And so the way that the squash comps was organised was each school put forward 4 players. And those players, they would rank them 1 to 4. And so it was this big knockout tournament across the whole state. And so you'd verse another school, your top player would verse their number 1 player, your second player would verse their second player, third and fourth. Have a guess what number I was. I was 5. I was number 4. And in fact, in the entire tournament, I don't think I won a single game in the whole thing. But yet I had a silver medal as a squash finalist for the state. In fact, it got so bad towards the end that I remember in the final, I got to the stage, but in each of the games, my goals were not to win, they were to win like 2 or 3 points. And if I got that, I felt happy about it. Now, on my team, we had a few secret weapons. Our number 1 player was actually pretty much the best squash player in the state. And so all the way through, no matter who he versed, he just smashed them the entire way through the competition. And then our second player, there was probably a couple of people that could have beaten him, but they would have been their team's number 1 player. And so he beat all of the 2 players. Our third person beat all of the third players. And for me, all I had to do was show up. But I think there's really a spiritual lesson here when it comes to the things that God calls us to do. God is on our team. And that's the thing that this promise is really wanting us to remember. God is on our team. He's the one that fights the battles. He's the one that brings the victory. Sometimes our job is just to show up. I want to give you a couple examples from the Old Testament stories where people just showed up and they trusted that their team was strong enough because God was on their team. The first one is another classic, David and Goliath. And so the story goes, there's Israelites, they're facing against the Philistines, and there's this mighty warrior named Goliath. He's a giant, and everyone is terrified of him, everyone except for this boy named David. And he wasn't, the giant is this guy trained in war. He has this heavy armor on, this sword and this javelin, and all these things, whereas all David has is this little sling. But he knows that there's someone on his team. And the words that he says as he's approaching Goliath I think, really show that he knew this and he believed this. And so he's walking down in that valley and he's picking up his stones, and this giant is taunting him. Who is this person? And he pulls his helmet back, and David says these words: "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." God is on my team. And that way, I just need to show up. Another story is the story of Elisha. And there's this moment in the story of Elisha where there's a foreign nation that wants him dead. And so the king sends this army to go and find Elisha and to capture him. And during the night, they find out where Elisha is staying, and this army comes and they surround the town where Elisha is. And they don't realize this during the night. They sort of sneak in. And Elisha has this servant. In the morning, he's just going on his walk, as he usually does, and he walks out the front gate of the town, and to his horror, he sees that surrounding them is this mighty army there to capture them. And he's just terrified, and he races back to Elisha. Elisha, help us. What are we going to do? This is terrible. We're going to die. And these are the words that Elisha says. And I just want you to sort of, again, look at how Elisha had this unmovable belief that God was with him. He says this: "Don't be afraid," the prophet answered. "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." This must have sounded very funny for this servant. I imagine him looking at them going, okay, 1, 2, hundreds of soldiers. And just think, what are you talking about? In what sense are those with us more than those who are with the enemy? And then Elisha does this. It says, Elisha prayed, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and he saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Now, what an amazing scene. I don't know what that would have looked like, but must have been this incredible scene of the angels, the armies of God suddenly brought into view for this servant. And he realized that, in fact, their team was much more powerful than the enemy. Strength and courage comes from realizing that God is on your team and by trusting in him. Now, in case you're wondering, thinking that maybe these stories are just from back in Bible times, I've got a story that I want to share. Now, this is what did happen back in the last century, but this is a story that's connected with my family that's really sort of dear to us. And this is something that happened in Vanuatu. Now, a number of years ago, I got to go to this place in Vanuatu. This is an island called Melakula. And if you look at the church there, it's called the Smith Memorial Adventist Church. And the reason it's called the Smith Memorial Church was because my great-grandfather and great-grandmother were missionaries here, pioneer missionaries in this part of Vanuatu back in the 1920s. And back in those days, Vanuatu was not the friendly place that it is today, but at least on this island here, it was one of the most dangerous places you could go in the South Pacific. And the tribes there were always warring, and they were cannibalistic, so they would capture people from the neighboring tribes, and they'd bring them back and do their ceremonies and eat them and all sorts of horrible things. And there was no sort of built-up infrastructure other than just these local tribes that have been living there for who knows how long. And so they came there, and they were there to bring the good news, the hope of Jesus to these people. And so they had this little house that they sort of were living in there, and a lot of people enjoyed them being there, but there were some people that didn't want them to be there. And there was a chief from one of the nearby islands who decided that he didn't want this family to be there. And so he got some of his warriors, and he went over to the island, and their plan was to, in the middle of the night, come up and surround and to attack this little house where my relatives, including my grandpa who'd been born over there, were living. And so they came up, and during the middle of the night, they came up and they went to attack this house. But to their surprise, they saw these shining men around the house where they were about to attack, these tall, shining men. And they were obviously shocked and surprised by this, and they raced back down from where they'd come from, and they waited the rest of the night. In the morning, they came back to the house to my great-grandfather, and they came to the door and they said, "We came here to attack you last night, but when we got here, there was all these bright, white, shining men. Where do you keep all these white, shining men?" And you can just imagine how shocked he would have been to hear this, not only that he was about to be attacked, but that this miracle had happened. And he realized that God had sent these armies of heaven, the angels, to come and protect him. And he said to the warrior, and said, "They're not here at the moment, but tonight they'll be back." And it was a really moving experience, because I've grown up hearing this story, but when we went back to Vanuatu, we actually, some of the local descendants of these people that live there in this area, they took us to the very foundation stones there where this house was, and one of the descendants of the local people there actually told us the story, and it was exactly like the story that we'd heard growing up, and it was such a moving experience for us. And so the God who was with Joshua and David and Elisha is with us today as well, and he wants to help us through the challenges we have. So strength and courage comes from realizing that God is with you, is on your team, and by trusting in him. Now, one of the things I thought I should sort of point out as we talk about this as well is that with God, strength is not just about feeling strong. Because you might be tempted to think from this, I don't feel courageous. I feel daunted. I feel scared of the things that lie before me. Am I really trusting of God if I don't feel strong? And I think one of the things that we find elsewhere in Scripture is that actually is sometimes those moments in your life when you feel the weakest, when you're actually at your strongest. And I'll give you an example. Back in the New Testament, in the book of 2 Corinthians, which we started in, Paul there, he's struggling with some sort of weakness. Now, we're not told exactly what this is, and there's a few people that sort of suggest a few different things, but there's something that's making him feel weak, and he desperately wants it gone, and he's praying with God to take away this weakness. And so he writes this, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And then Paul writes, therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And so if you're here today feeling weak, that is not necessarily a weakness. But if you allow that to allow you to draw nearer to God, that weakness can actually be one of your greatest strengths. So with God, strength is not about feeling strong. Strength is about trust and how deeply we are trusting the God who is on our team. So strength comes from, as I said, from realizing God is on your team and from trusting him. And so there's 3 things I want to add to this main point as we're thinking about this promise. And the first one is this, is that God is the team leader. He's not just on your team, but he's on your team as the team leader. Now, imagine Joshua. He's been given this really incredible task from God to go into the land of Canaan, to attack these fortified cities and these giants, and to lead this difficult people on this endeavor. And he's probably thinking, how can I make this actually be successful? And as we go a little bit further on in the book of Joshua, we find Joshua by the walls of Jericho, which is kind of interesting because they're the enemy, and we're not told exactly why he was down there by Jericho, but he's there maybe sort of sussing out where they're going to attack and what's going to happen. And he's down there, but he must have felt a little bit anxious because he's in enemy territory. And so he's down there by Jericho, and he lifts up his eyes and looks, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. Now, if you're worried about being in the enemy territory, this is a scary moment. But Joshua doesn't run away. He confronts the man, and he goes up to him and he says these words, are you for us or for our adversaries? And he receives this response that doesn't really make any sense given the question that he was asked. It says, and he said, this man, no. But I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. Now, he didn't ask a yes-no question. He said, are you with us or are you with them? And the soldier with his sword says, no. What did he mean by that? Well, there's probably a couple of ways you can understand this. Firstly, one of the things that we learned from our stories of Jonah over the last couple of weeks is that God isn't just for you, he's also for your enemies. Isn't that right? And God's love extends both for the people of Canaan and for the Israelites as well. And so which side is we're going to find out this character is also God in a second. Which side is he on? Both sides. But secondly, the way that Joshua frames his question is almost like, are you here to help us on our task? Are you here just as one of our team members, or are you one of our enemies? Whereas this being is not actually just there as one of the team members, but he's there as the team leader. And so he says, no, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. And when Joshua realizes this, he falls on his face to the earth and worships and said to him, what does my Lord say of his servant? And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so. And that should remind us of another story. When Moses was at the burning bush and God said to Moses, take off your sandals because you're standing on holy ground. And this gives us a little insight that maybe this being that Joshua came was actually one of the times when we encountered Jesus in the Old Testament. That's what I believe was who he encountered here. This is Jesus here, the commander of the armies of the Lord. He wasn't just there as one of the team members. He was the team leader. And so when Joshua realizes this, he falls down and just is in awe and reverence and worship. What are the things that you are asking God to help you with? Maybe it's a relationship and you're saying, God, I don't know what to do here. I need your help in this relationship. Is it a career that you've been working towards? God, this is really important for me. I really pray that you'll help this to happen. Finances, other goals. I want to challenge you this morning are you inviting God to be on your team? Are you inviting God into these spaces as your team leader? When God is with us, he's with us as Lord, he's with us as King, he's with us as the leader of our team. So that's number one. God is the team leader. Number two is this. God wants the best for us. I think this is really important to remember because I think one of the reasons we find it hard to allow God to be the leader in our life, because sometimes we don't really believe that what God wants for us is what's best for us. But I want you to know today that God is your creator, he's your father, he wants what is best for you. And we can trust him because he's always going to act in our best interests. And I want to just share a number of other promises that really show this point that God is for us and he has our best interests in mind. So as I read these, I want you just to sort of let these promises just sink into your heart. The first one is this. Jesus says, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Number two. Which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone, or if he asks for fish, will give him a snake? How much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? God is our Father who wants to give us good things. For you created my inmost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. God created us. He knows our heart's desires. He knows the things we long for. He knows how to give us good things. He wants to give us good things because he is our maker. Luke 12, are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? Yet not one of them is forgotten by God. Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Don't be afraid, you are worth more than many sparrows. And finally, Romans 8:31. If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Relationships, careers, finances, goals. What are the things this year that you are hoping to achieve? What are the things that are hanging over you and causing you to stress? I invite you just to come to God with an attitude of surrender and to lay those things at his feet, knowing that he's got the power to help you, but he actually wants to help you with those things as well. So God is a team leader. God wants what's best for us. And the third thing is this. God is with us, But the question is, are we with God? God promises to always be with us, but it's really up to us. Do we want to really draw near to him? Before our key verse today is Joshua chapter 1, verse 9, which is one repeated a number of times. Be strong and courageous. But the verse before that is really interesting. And there's also a promise in there as well. And I think it really connects with the key promise that we have for today. And the promise that's in Joshua chapter 1, verse 8 says this. God gave Joshua this instruction as leader of this people. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Now, I want you to just place yourself in Joshua's shoes. If you are going to make a plan and you're wanting to do the things that are going to help you be successful in this mission, what are the things you would think would be on that list? I would think having enough soldiers, having strong enough weapons, having good enough battle plans. But according to God speaking to Joshua, the thing that would make the difference had nothing to do with any of those. The thing that would make the difference was if Joshua takes this book of the law, which was really just their portion of the Bible that they had at that stage, for Joshua to take this Bible portion that he had and to read it day and night, meditate on it, and try to live out the things that he saw. That was the thing that God said would make the difference between success and failure. And it makes me think of all those things that we described that we're facing in our life this year to come. The thing that's going to create the success is not how smart you are. It's not your IQ or your EQ or your degree or these sorts of things. The thing that's really going to make you prosperous is, what are you doing with your relationship with God? How are you drawing near to him? God promised to always be with us, but are we actually seeking out that presence? In James chapter 4 and verse 8, it says this, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. So God is a team leader. God wants the best for us. God is with us, but are we with him? Strength and courage comes from realizing that God is on your team and trusting in him. So this year, I really just want to give you this challenge. As you face this year ahead, realize that God is with you. Trust in that. Trust that he not only can help you, but he wants to help you. And realize that sometimes all you have to do is just show up and be clinging to God. And so let's finish by just letting the words of this promise sink deep into our hearts. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go.